Iran from ancient times to the 3rd century AD. In the 3 millennia BCE, on the territory of modern Iran, there was a primitive human culture. The oldest inhabitants of Iran were hunting and pastoral tribes. Nomadic pastoralists lived in the east of Iran. In the west lived sedentary pastoralists, who were also engaged in agriculture. In addition, the population was engaged in hunting. These tribes retained the tribal system, and sometimes united in tribal unions. The tribe consisted of several contacts with him, which led to the fact that the process of decomposition of the primitive communal system and the emergence of a class slave-owning society in Elam began earlier than in other regions of Iran. At the same time, the primitiveness of the Elamite society found its expression in the preservation of patriarchal relations and remnants of matriarchy. The valley of the Karen River and the slopes of the mountain ranges to the east of it were inhabited by the tribes of Elam, who were also engaged in cattle breeding, hunting and agriculture. From ancient times, during the 3 and 2 millennia BCE, Elam waged wars and somehow came into contact with the more developed states of Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, Babylonia and Assyria. This proximity to Mesopotamia and permanent Elam consisted of a large number of small kingdoms, the rulers of which did not enjoy unlimited power. The most developed of these kingdoms was the state of Susa. Its capital was the city of Susa, the ruins of which are located near the modern city of Desful. In the sacred book of the Zoroastrians, Avesta 1, it is stated that the Iranian tribes allegedly came to Iran from the vast pastures of Central Asia. The penetration of barbarian pastoral tribes from Central Asia into the territory of modern Iran in ancient times, apparently, took place, just as it happened repeatedly in subsequent times. However, the assumption that the Iranian tribes, as a completely new and separate ethnic group, appeared only as a result of their coming from Central Asia, would be little substantiated. Most likely, the Iranian tribes were formed as a result of mixing of local residents with newcomers. The population thus formed was called the Aryans, and the country began to be called the country of the Aryans, from which, it is believed, its modern name Iran comes. It should be noted that even in ancient times there was a separation of the Eastern, Central Asian, Iranians from the Western ancestors of the current Farsis, the Persians. This isolation subsequently led to the independence of the history of these two kindred ethnic groups. At present, bourgeois and Iranian nationalist historians, based on pseudoscientific pan-Iranian concepts, attribute the cultural achievements of the Central Asian Iranians to the Iranians in general, thus trying to belittle the historical role of the Central Asian Iranians, the ancestors of the Soviet Central Asian peoples. The oldest public formation on the Iranian plateau, about which there is more or less reliable information, was the Median Kingdom, which occupied the territory of present-day northwestern Iran and Azerbaijan. Testify that its population was engaged in both cattle breeding, nomadic and sedentary, and agriculture. The Median Kingdom was not yet a developed class state, but was a confederation of several tribes. Herodotus mentions 6 Median tribes. In the 8th centuries BCE, in Median society, the process of decomposition of the tribal system had already begun, and class differences began to appear. On the one hand, tribal nobility stood out, and on the other hand, along with the development of settled pastoralism and agriculture, slavery appeared. Subsequently, due to the need to defend against the Assyrians, who in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE systematically raided the Medes, slavery began to play a more significant role. This accelerated the process of the development of the Median tribal union into the slave-owning Median state, which was also facilitated by the growth of property inequality and the increase in the number of slaves. Yet the state was still in its embryonic form. Assyrian inscriptions and other sources say that kings were at the head of Media. In the 7th century BCE, the Median Kingdom was already a strong ancient eastern power. Its center was the city of Ecbatana, modern Hamadan. The Medes had to wage a constant struggle with their neighbors. In the east, they fought with nomadic tribes that were not part of the Median alliance, and in the west, with Assyria, Urartu, and other ancient eastern states. Taking advantage of the weakening of Assyria, the Medes, in alliance with the Babylonians, by 605 BCE, destroyed this state. Then they conquered Urartu, and part of Asia Minor. At the beginning of the 6th century BCE, the Medes conquered the southern branch of the Iranian tribes, the Parsua tribes, or Persian tribes that lived in the southwest of the Iranian plateau. In the area that was called Parsa in ancient Persian, modern Fars, almost the entire territory to the Amud Doria in the northeast and up to the Persian Gulf in the south was included in the kingdom of Media. The conquests of the Medes were stopped by the Persian tribes that rebelled against them. Led by them in 558 BCE, one of the largest figures of the Persian state that was formed after that, Cyrus, in Persian Kurush, stood up. Cyrus came from the Acamenid family, a strong Persian tribe that lived in the region of Pars. The state founded by Cyrus was called the Acamenid state. By 550 BCE, the Medes were subordinated to Cyrus and became part of the state he created, the hegemony in which belonged to the Persian tribes. But the Persians who conquered Media adopted the higher culture of the Medes. In the 6th century BCE, Persian tribes, as well as the Medes, were in the state of decomposition of the tribal system. But after the conquest of the Median kingdom, the process of class stratification in the Persian tribes and the growth of slavery intensified. And the union of Iranian tribes began to turn into a slave-owning state, the economic base of which, along with slaveholding, were agricultural communities. The capital of this state was the former capital of the Medes, Ecbatana. Before the transfer of the capital to Ecbatana, the royal residences were the cities of Pasargada and Persepolis. Cyrus created a Persian army consisting of cavalry and infantry, which, in their fighting qualities, surpassed all the troops of other ancient eastern states contemporary to them. Relying on his army, Cyrus began to implement a policy of conquest. Persian troops invaded Asia Minor and in 546 BCE, conquered the Lydian state, took the capital of Lydia, Sardis, and captured the Lydian king Croesus, the owner of innumerable treasures, whose wealth became a proverb, and the name became a household name for a rich man. The Greek city-states on the coast of Asia Minor were also captured. Capturing all of Asia Minor, Cyrus launched an offensive to the south to Babylonia. By 538 BCE, Babylonia was also conquered and incorporated into the Persian Empire. After that, Cyrus set himself the task of conquering Egypt. But before opposing Egypt, he decided to expand his eastern borders and headed northeast to subjugate the Bactrian Kingdom and numerous Central Asian pastoral tribes, the Sacs and Massagets. Cyrus managed to subjugate Bactria, Sogd and Khwarezm, but the peoples of these Central Asian states put up fierce resistance to him. And in one of the battles with the Massagetes in 529 BCE, he was killed. His son Cambyses, in Persian Cambodia, came to the throne. In 526 BCE, Cambyses, continuing the conquests of his father, went on a campaign against Egypt and conquered it. Following this, Cambyses made an unsuccessful attempt to conquer Nubia. During these campaigns, an uprising of the Medes broke out in Iran, led by Gormata. Gormata's revolt was an attempt by the Medes to regain their independence. Upon learning of this, Cambyses hurried to Iran, but died on the way, 522 BC. Following the uprising of Gormata, other uprisings of the discontented population broke out in different regions of the huge Persian state. Ruined by heavy exactions and endless campaigns of Cyrus and Cambyses, the countries conquered by Cyrus and Cambyses fell away, and actually became independent again. One of the Acamenids, Darius in Persian, Darius 522 to 486 BC, the son of Hystaspes, the ruler of a remote province of Persia, spoke out against the rebellious Medes. A large inscription on the Bisutun rock, located 40 kilometers east of Kermanshah, tells about the events before the accession of Darius. In a short time, Darius not only conquered Media, but also subjugated all the countries previously conquered by Cyrus and Cambyses, and then captured new countries: Thrace, the islands of the Aegean Sea and the Greek North African colonies. Although Iran itself was relatively sparsely populated, and it is believed, there were no more than 1 million people on the entire Iranian plateau. The Achaemenid kings still managed to create a huge power, which was only a conglomerate of tribes and nationalities that lived their own lives and had their own languages. It included all of Iran, Azerbaijan, Afghanistan, the southern part of Central Asia, Balochistan, all of Asia Minor, Babylonia, Armenia, Thrace, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Cyrenaica. Darius also conquered Arabia, the islands of the Aegean Sea, the northeastern part of the Balkan Peninsula, and Macedonia. During his campaigns, he even reached the steppes of the northern Black Sea region. Under Darius, Persia was finally formalized into a state, a centralized slave-owning Eastern despotism, headed by the King of Kings, as the Achaemenid kings called themselves. The capital of the Achaemenids was moved from Ecbatana to the city of Susa. The main occupation of the population was agriculture. All the land was formerly considered the property of the King of Kings, but most of it was in the possession of the agricultural communities that cultivated it. The entire Persian state, according to Herodotus, was divided into 20 satrapies. Satrapies were large provinces, the borders of which in some cases corresponded to the borders of the old states included in the Achaemenid state. So, for example, Egypt was one satrapy, Babylonia another. Asia Minor was divided into several satrapies, which in general also corresponded to the old state formations. At the head of the satrapies were the satraps, the rulers of the regions, who were unlimited overlords of the entire population of the satrapies. The satraps were in charge of tax collection, leased out, the court, the recruitment of troops, the minting of silver coins, etc. The actions of the satraps were controlled by the king as through military leaders independent of the satraps, commanders of special military districts, and through special officials, inspectors, who traveled around the satrapies. In the satrapies were troops subordinate to the commander of the military districts, which included several satrapies. There were 5 such military districts. The Achaemenid troops had in their composition a nucleus loyal to them from the Persians. In addition to the Persian detachments, the troops also included detachments from the inhabitants of the conquered regions. But the Persians constantly strived to ensure that the troops located in one or another satrapy did not consist of its natives. A network of good roads was built connecting the satrapies with Susa, along which troops could be hastily transferred, if necessary, from one satrapy to another. The so-called Royal Road, from the shores of the Aegean Sea to the Persian Gulf, as well as the road from Babylon to Bactria and to the borders of India, passing by the Baisutun Mountains, near Kermanshah, were of the greatest importance. On the roads there were military posts that ensured the safety of travelers, and caravanserais, relay mail was organized. Thanks to good roads, trade was widely developed. The largest trading center of the state was the city of Babylon. Monetary circulation was greatly developed, and only the king himself had the right to mint a gold coin. Not only the construction of roads, but also other construction activities were widely developed. For example, on the orders of Darius, grandiose works were carried out to dig a canal between the Mediterranean and Red Seas. In general, the development of culture under the Achaemenids reached a fairly high level. The peoples of Central Asia, the Bactrians, Khwarezmians, Sogdians and Soccars, played a huge role in the creation of the Achaemenid culture. The Achaemenids took advantage of the achievements of the old culture of the countries of Western Asia, Babylonia, etc., in the field of agriculture, crafts, architecture, religion, art and writing. In particular, the Achaemenids borrowed the cuneiform writing system from Mesopotamia. It was in cuneiform that the famous inscription on the Baisutun rock was made, telling about the victories of Darius. Significant development under the Achaemenids received architecture. In their residences, the Achaemenids erected monumental buildings that were supposed to testify to the power and greatness of the Achaemenid state. The most famous monuments of Achaemenid architecture are the tomb of Cyrus in the early Achaemenid residence of Pasargada, the royal palace in Susa and the palaces of Darius and Xerxes in Persepolis, about 60 kilometers north of Shiraz. The ruins of the palace, with a 100-columned hall, have survived to this day. In Persepolis, which in Iran is called Take Jemshid, Jemshid's throne, the remains of the main entrance with winged bulls carved on huge stones, columns 18-20 m high in the main reception hall. Numerous bas-reliefs depicting Acamenid kings and warriors, and many other monuments of the Acamenid era. These magnificent palaces were created by the best masters of various nationalities that inhabited the Acamenid state: Egyptians, Greeks, Medes, Babylonians, Sogdians, Bactrians, Khwarezmians, etc. The buildings were decorated with monumental sculptures in the form of stone reliefs, colored tiles, paintings, gold ornaments, wood carvings and ivory, etc. Artistic craft was highly developed in the Acamenid state. This is evidenced by the monuments that have come down to us: vessels, various jewelry made of precious metals and other items. The State Hermitage Museum in Leningrad possesses the most valuable collection of works of art from the Acamenid era, which have survived to this day. Valuable monuments of the Acamenid culture are also in the Pushkin State Museum of Fine Arts in Moscow. The dominant religion of the Acamenids was Mazdaism, the basis of which was the cult of the sky god, the creator of the universe Ahura Mazda, and the deification of royal power. The Acamenid kings were considered the chosen ones of Ahura Mazda, through whom the divine will is proclaimed to the world. Along with the cult of Ahura Mazda, the Persians also revered the cult of the sun and light god Mithra, which was close to the cult of Ahura Mazda. The cult of sacred fire was also widespread, in connection with which the ancient Persians are called fire worshippers. The Acamenid kings attached great importance to religion, seeing it as an important means of strengthening their power. Darius I and Xerxes even carried out a special religious reform for this purpose, which amounted to undermining the significance of the Devas, the gods of the Iranian tribes, and promoting the cult of the great sky god Ahura Mazda, who had previously been revered along with the gods of the tribes, to the first place. Mazdaism of the Acamenids has many similarities with Zoroastrianism. However, as the works of Soviet scientists proved, Mazdaism of the Acamenids was not identical to Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest religions, originated in the East, in Bactria. This ancient religion, according to legend, was formalized in the 6th century BCE, the prophet Zoroaster, after whom it received the name Zoroastrianism. The main religious monument of Zoroastrianism is the sacred book of the Zoroastrians, the Vesta, the origin of which is also associated with the East and Central Asian regions of the Achaemenid state. Zoroastrianism and the Avesta included many ancient folk traditions and myths. This religious doctrine was based on the concept of the struggle in the world of two principles, good and evil. Fire and light were considered to be a good beginning, and darkness was considered evil. The forces of good and light were personified in the creator of the universe, the god Ahura Mazda, Greek name Ormuzd. And the forces of evil and darkness, in the Deva god Ankara Mainyu, Ahriman. In addition to the cult of the two main gods, good and evil, Zoroastrianism also preserved cults of other gods, earth, sky, water and fire. Subsequently, the cult of the god of fire merged with the cult of the main god Ahura Mazda. Of great importance in Zoroastrianism was also the cult of the sun and light god Mithra, who was associated with agriculture. In general, according to the teachings of Zarathustra, agriculture was considered a sacred occupation, and was made a duty to his followers. Zoroastrianism subsequently spread throughout Iran, and became the dominant religion. Under the Sassanids, as we shall see later, it was the officially recognized religion in Iran. The main support of the Persian kings was the large slave-owning nobility in the conquered countries and the Persian tribes. The Persians were the dominant people among other peoples of the Achaemenid state, and enjoyed a number of benefits and advantages. They were free, did not pay tribute, and were also exempted from paying taxes, from forced labor in construction work, etc. The Persians constituted the main core of the Achaemenid army. In particular, only the privileged personal guard of the Achaemenid kings consisted of them. The bureaucracy was also completed from their midst. The situation of the laboring masses of the peoples conquered by the Achaemenids was extremely difficult. They had to pay huge taxes for the maintenance of the government apparatus and the army. Persian officials treated them with contempt and ruthlessly plundered them. The conquered peoples repeatedly raised uprisings against the Acamenids. Slaves were subjected to merciless exploitation, of which there were many in the Persian regions proper. The growth of contradictions between the parasitic slave-owning nobility and the conquered peoples and slaves prepared the conditions for the weakening of the slave-owning Achaemenid state. From the second half of the 5th century BCE, the weakening of the Achaemenid state began. The main reason for this weakening and its further fall under the blows of the Greeks was the lack of appropriate socio-economic prerequisites for the existence of such a huge power. The Achaemenid state, as well as the later state of Alexander the Great, according to Comrade Stalin, was random and little connected conglomerates of groups, disintegrating and uniting depending on the successes or defeats of one or another conqueror. The first defeat was the previously invincible armies of Darius in the famous Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE, when the Athenians successfully repulsed the attack of the selected Persian army, which waged a war of conquest in Greece. In 480 and 479 years BCE, the son of Darius Xerxes again tried to suppress the uprisings of the Greeks who fought for the independence of their homeland, but also failed. Following these uprisings, the Greek offensive against Persia began. The struggle of the Greeks against the Achaemenids ended with the fall of the Achaemenid state. Under the leadership of one of the outstanding commanders of antiquity, Alexander the Great, the Greeks by 330 BCE conquered the main cities of Persia, Susa, Persepolis, and Ecbatana, and after that the entire Achaemenid state. The success of Alexander the Great was greatly facilitated by the unstable situation within the Achaemenid state itself. The huge amounts of taxes exacted from the satrapies in order to ensure the unheard-of luxury of the Persian nobility, along with the use of a tax farming system, completely ruined the provinces and aroused the hatred of the population for the ruling strata. At the same time, in the troops of the last Achaemenid Darius III, the number of Persians was relatively small and the bulk of them were mercenaries who, without any zeal, fought for the Achaemenids. The broad masses of the Persian population, with the help of which the Persians defeated the Medes, under the last Achaemenids, began to be enslaved by the slave-owning nobility. If Alexander the Great conquered western Iran without much difficulty, then in the east his troops met fierce resistance, which lasted about 3 years. The reason for this was that in the east of Iran and especially in neighboring Khwarezm, Margiana, Bactria and Sogd, the broad masses of the people were not yet enslaved and their communities were collectives of free farmers, shepherds and warriors. Soviet archaeologists, with their excavations in Khwarezm, discovered settlements that testify to the presence of military democracy in those areas at that time. The Greeks defeated the Persian state and created their own huge military slave-owning empire, stretching eastward to India. However, soon after the death of Alexander, which followed in 323 BCE, the empire he created broke up into a number of states. On the territory from Syria, Phoenicia and Asia Minor in the west to the Indus River in the east, a state was formed, headed by one of the commanders of Alexander, Seleucus. The center of the Seleucid state was Syria, and all other countries that were part of it, including Iran, were provinces of this state. But already in the 3rd century BCE, Central Asia, and almost all of eastern Iran fell away from the state of the Seleucids, on the territory of which the Greco-Bactrian and Parthian kingdoms arose. Thus, after the fall of the Achaemenid state, the East Iranian peoples became the bearers of statehood: Bactrians, Khwarezmians, Parthians. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom arose on the territory of 3 ancient regions: Bactria with the main city of Bactriborg, Sogdiana with the main city of Samarkand, then Marakanda and Margiana, near the modern city of Merv. This kingdom was ruled by the Greek dynasty of the former governors of the Seleucids. During the heyday of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, modern Afghanistan was part of it, and the boundaries of the kingdom extended to the Indus River. In 135 BCE, the Greco-Bactrian kingdom was invaded by nomadic tribes, the Kushans. These tribes destroyed the power of the Greco-Bactrian kings in most of the territories previously subordinated to them, and ousted them from Central Asia and Afghanistan. After that, the Greek Bactrian dynasty existed for about 50 years on the banks of the Indus River. Almost simultaneously with the emergence of the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom, the Parthian Kingdom was formed, 247 BC, 224 AD. At the head of this kingdom was a dynasty that emerged from the Parthian tribes, Parks. The founder of the dynasty and the kingdom was Arshak the Great, 247 to 212 BC, and the dynasty itself was called the Arshakids dynasty. At first, the Parthian kingdom included only the regions located to the east and southeast of the Caspian Sea. His ancient residence was the city of Nisa, not far from present-day Ashgabat. Excavations by Soviet archaeologists of the residence of the Parthian kings in Nisa provided very valuable information on the history of the Parthian state. Chinese information about the peoples of Central Asia, translated by the Russian Orientalist Nikita Yakovlevich, Iakinf, Bicharin, is also of considerable value for studying the history of the Parthian kingdom. At the end of the 2nd century BCE, in the struggle against the Seleucids, the Arshakids managed to expand the boundaries of their possessions and include in their composition the entire Iranian plateau, Armenia and part of Mesopotamia. After the collapse of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, the region of Margiana was annexed to the Parthian kingdom. Thus, the Parthian kingdom occupied a vast territory. The Arsacids sought to expand their possessions also at the expense of Western Arabia, Asia Minor and Egypt, that is, to bring their possessions to the extent that the state of the Acamenids reached. In the east, the Parthian kingdom had already made contact with China. From the middle of the 2nd century BCE, in the north, the Arshakids had to repel the attacks of the Huns. For the internal social structure of the Parthian kingdom, as well as for the Greco-Bactrian kingdom and the state of the Seleucids, apparently, the predominance of slave-owning relations was characteristic. But along with slave-owning relations in Iran at that time, as well as in most other countries of the East, there were social relations characteristic of the period of decomposition of the primitive communal system. The agricultural community continued to exist. Excavations by Soviet archaeologists in southern Turkmenistan have established that the Park tribes led a nomadic lifestyle north of Parthia, or were semi-sedentary pastoralists. They were dominated by patriarchal slave-holding relations. From the environment of the tribe, the nobility already stood out, which owned herds and slaves as their own property. In the war, she acted in the form of heavily armed cavalry and played an important role in the outcome of the battle. This also contributed to its isolation from the general mass of the tribe. The people were in patriarchal dependence on the nobility. But patriarchal tribal relations in Parthian society were supplanted by slave-owning ones. Politically, the Parthian kingdom, according to sources, was not as centralized as the state of the Acamenids, but consisted of a number of possessions, some of which were in fact completely independent of the central government. Even more than the Achaemenid state, the Parthian kingdom was a conglomeration of various tribes and nationalities. Of the architectural monuments of the Parthian era that have survived to this day, one should point out the remains of the so-called Temple of Solomon, Masjid Solomon. The religion under the Arsacids was Zoroastrianism, mixed with the worship of ancestors, the sun, the moon, and also Greek deities. Women isolated themselves from the society of men and wore a veil. The language in common use was Parthian, which was later called the Pahlavi. By the time the Parthians broke the dominance of the Seleucids, they had a new, much stronger and more dangerous enemy in the west in the person of the Roman Empire. For several centuries, between the Parthian state and the Roman Empire, there was, with varying success, an almost continuous struggle for mastering the trade routes between the East, India, China, and the West, the Mediterranean coast, Mesopotamia, Armenia, etc. In 53 ADE, the Parthian commander Surin, during the war with the Romans over the possession of Syria, lured the Roman troops under the command of Crassus into the Syrian desert, and almost completely destroyed them here. Regarding these military operations of the Parthians against the Romans, IV Stalin wrote in his reply to Comrade Razin, "Ruined them, by the beginning of the 3rd century ADE, the advantage was on the side of the Romans, who captured Armenia and a significant part of Mesopotamia." In the 2nd decade of the 3rd century, one of the last Parthian kings, Artabanus, managed to conquer Armenia and most of Mesopotamia from the Romans and inflicted several defeats on them. But at that time, 224, in southwestern Iran, in present-day Fars, an uprising arose led by one of the petty rulers, Artashir-Pupa Khan, who ended the rule of the Parthian dynasty weakened by internal contradictions in Iran and laid the foundation for a new dynasty, the Sassanids. By the name of Sasan, the grandfather of the founder of the new dynasty.